actually getting at in this semester. So Brit Lit 1 is supposed to cover from roughly 500 to about 1700. I never cover that much. We cover from about 500 to about 1650. Okay? I probably should include Milton, but I don't. Why? We have an entire course just on Milton. We don't have an entire course for undergraduates on Beowulf. We don't have an entire course for undergraduates on Donne, or I think we do for Chaucer. Multiple courses for Shakespeare, etc. But a lot of students don't take those courses in Shakespeare. Okay? So I try to give a little bit, but we're not going to include Milton. So we're going to do roughly the earliest Old English, which is Cadman's Hymn, to about 1650 with Robert Herrick and Andrew Marvell and such. So let's start over here with all these dates and periods. So we're going to cover three major periods. Okay? The Old English period, the Middle English period, and the early modern English period. So I'm going to change that to roughly, let's say 1650. Okay? So, the Old English period. These are rough dates. These are circa 500 to 1100. Why? Well, because we assume that Old English as a language, okay, was probably begun spoken around 500 AD. And we'll talk a little bit about the history behind that. And it stops being spoken roughly around 1100. The earliest Middle English document we can actually date. It's 1135. We have an actual document that we can say, this is the first written form of Middle English. Okay? It's the Peterborough version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. So the Middle English period is roughly 1100 to 1500. Now, we could fudge a little bit on this, and we can maybe give an actual historical date to say, yeah, well, the Middle English or the medieval period ends on this date, 1485. We'll talk about that in a moment. Okay? So then the early modern period goes from roughly 1500 to, as I said, roughly 1700. But we're not going to go as far up as 1700. So let's go back to the first part, because this is what we'll be studying first. These are all dates, important dates, for the Old English or Anglo-Saxon, as it's also called. And you'll see why in a couple of minutes. Okay? So, let's start with the very early dates. The very early dates, man. Sleep deprived and sick at the same time. 55 BC. What is that date? That's the date Caesar, Julius Caesar, annexes Britannia. Doesn't have anybody there, but it's annexed. Part of the Roman Empire, even though there are no Romans there. You can imagine the Celts at that time probably thought what they thought of that. Okay? 44 BC is when Caesar invades. Or I might take that back. I might have that wrong. I might have it that he invades in 55 and it's annexed in 44. I think that's it. Like I said, my brain is fried. Okay? The next invaded in 55, annexed in 44 BC. Okay? Caesar then dies in like 33. Okay? So we're going to skip a big long time. So what happens as a result of the annexing and the invasion? What kind of speakers enter the Isle of Britain? Latin. So Latin, the language, starts mixing into the native Celtic language. Okay? Need an example? Here's one. Campus. The Latin word enters Celtic, okay, then gets borrowed into, after the Anglo-Saxons come, Anglo-Saxon, and becomes our modern English campus. One of the meanings of which is simply field. Okay? Another one that comes in, castra, not castrate castra, that's a different kind, but castra, which then becomes Chester, which becomes modern English dash Chester, like Rochester, Chichester, okay, which just means place of, okay. So you have the Latin speakers, the legions and such, and then their families eventually start to come in and follow them. Come in, and you get a period of roughly 400 years of Roman domination of the Isle of Britain. Okay? Now, they never entirely conquer Britain. They conquer most of it. They conquer Britain as far north as what is today Hadrian's Wall. Why? Because the Emperor Hadrian builds a wall across the north of England from the North Sea to the Irish Sea. And he builds that to keep certain people out. The Picts and Scots. Why? Because the legions could not defeat the Picts and Scots. All right? They also pretty much stop, because they don't completely conquer the area in the Western Isles, or excuse me, the western part of Britain. There's a map in here somewhere. I'm not going to look for it. Of what today is called Wales. Okay? They did not call themselves Welsh or Wales. They are the Cymry, and they live in the Cymru. Right? Why? Because Wales and Welsh are words that come from Anglo-Saxon. And they are words that mean foreigner, exile. Well, who are the Welsh foreign from? Or where were they exiled from? The rest of Britain. The rest of what we today call England. They were people pushed westward by the Roman legions and by the later advances of the Anglo-Saxons that we'll come to talk about. Okay? To some extent, some of them were. Others were Celts who had lived there in Wales for thousands of years. Celts had been in Britain, probably since at least 1000 BC. Okay. Celts weren't necessarily the ones who built Stonehenge. Those were pre-Celt, more than likely. We don't know who those people actually are. They just know they built big rock structures. Okay? So the next important date, 410 AD. What happens in 410 AD? Two things. Rome is sacked, okay, by the Goths. Okay? And as a result of Rome being sacked, as a result of the attacks, Rome calls in its legions that are at the periphery of the empire, calls them to come defend Rome. Well, that includes the legions that are in Britain. Okay? So, what does nature abhor? Anybody know? A vacuum. A vacuum. When the legions leave Britain, they create a power vacuum. They're the ones keeping the peace. Because when the legions leave, you have the now Romano-Celts left behind. People have intermarried with Roman citizens, okay? Because although the Roman legions leave, their families don't. Families stay behind. Some of the legionnaires stay behind, those who have served their time in the military and such. Okay? So they leave, and you have this big sucking sound because you still have the Picts and Scots north of Hadrian's Wall that he built. Well, when they realize the Roman legions have gone, they also realize that land south of the wall is now ripe for the picking. Okay? So they start little skirmishes and invasions. Okay? Everything I'm going to say from this point on largely comes from that's an E. Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People, okay, which he writes in the year 731. Bede tells us that around the year 449 or so, a Romano-Celtic chieftain by the name of Vortigern, who lived in the eastern part of what I'm going to now call England, even though it's not England yet, it's still Britain. In the eastern part of that country, sent a letter to his Germanic relatives asking for aid against the Picts and Scots who were invading from the north. I don't have a pointer. But where you see the United Kingdom and the line across the top, that's not quite, but that's close to where Hadrian's Wall is. Okay? So when Bede writes, Vortigern is in this area. Think of Cambridge kind of as the central area. He's writing for help because of these tribes coming down from the north. Okay? The place he writes to help for is over here in northern Germany and southern what today is Denmark. Okay? He writes for help and he gets help. These two Saxon leaders named Hengist and Horsa, both of their names, by the way, mean stallion. These are studs. Okay? They come over and they help. They lead troops of mercenaries. Okay? One of the things that happens, however, as a result of these Germanic mercenaries coming over, is they also realize this territory is ripe for the picking. These Romano-Celtic people are pushovers. Okay? If you look at that map, it's not quite accurate because this area is actually farther north than this appears, than just this. Okay? So, growing seasons, all that kind of stuff, shorter in northern Germany than they are in England. Okay? And the land in this area of England is very fertile. So, they come over and some of them start to stay. These are the beginnings in 449, 450 of what Bede refers to as the Anglo-Saxon invasions. The invasions. Now, I don't remember what your book says, but your book might use the term migrations. What's the difference between migrations and invasions? Yeah, one's hostile, and the other one's, hey, we're just coming, we want to live, we want to get along, we want to be nice with each other. The other one is, get out of my way, I'm taking your land. Okay? Bede calls them invasions. Why? They didn't come and stay for a while and then go back home. You know, like when you drive across the country, you enter one state and it'll have a welcome to, and then often beneath that, have a nice day. What does that imply? But leave when you're done, you know. We don't want you staying here. We want you to go back to where you came from. Okay? The Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, however, all stayed. Okay? Let me pull up another map. Just one will work. That'll work. Okay. So, if you look at a map of England today, some of these terms still apply. You've got East Anglia, the bump off to the side, it's still called East Anglia. Why? Because it's the area where the Angles settled. The area west of that was originally called West Anglia. Okay? Not because there are East Anglians in Germany and West Anglians in Germany. It's Anglia, where all the Angles settled, and then that gets divided into East and West. Canterbury, down in Kent, where the blue arrow's coming down, or no, it's pointing towards Sussex, Wessex. But down at this point, this is where the Jutes settled. Okay? So you have the Angles, the Jutes, and then the Saxons settled across the southern shore. It was often called, in the Anglo-Saxon period, the Saxon shore. So you have Essex, East Saxons, Sussex, South Saxons, Wessex, the West Saxons. Okay? So when the Germanic tribes came over, they settled in kind of particular areas. The Angles settled in one area, the Midlands of England. The Saxons settled the southern shore area, primarily of England. Okay? And the Jutes settled in that little part that sticks off right here of southern England. Okay? Those began 449, 450. Took them a while to get control. But they have control. That is, what was called Britain becomes called Angloland, Angloland, within 150 years. How do we know? Because in the year 597, Pope Gregory I of Rome sends missionaries to Angloland. Why? Because earlier, before he was Pope, he was visiting the slave market in Rome, and he met two children. Again, this is all according to Bede. He met two children, fair of face, blonde hair, blue-eyed, Nordic types, okay? And spoke to them, whether through an interpreter or not, I don't remember, and asked them where they were from. And they said, Angloland. We are Angles. 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 And he turned that into a pun. He said, no, you are not Angles. You are Angelus. Angels. Messengers. He said, he interpreted his meeting with them as being a message from God, that he was to send missionaries to these people because they didn't know anything about Christ as a result of his conversation with them in the slave market. So, when he becomes Pope, he sends messengers. He sends a team of missionaries. Okay? And the person who leads that is a man called St. Augustine. This is not the St. Augustine who wrote The City of God. This is not the St. Augustine who was the Bishop of Hippo in North Africa. Okay? That's a different Augustine. This Augustine goes, and we're going to read a little bit about this when we read the little section in the book, and fairly quickly, the now Germanic people who live in England in 597, fairly quickly they accept Christianity. And Bede tells us why. Okay? He gives us an account, a verbal account of what happens with one of the kings and one of the king's chief priests, that is, chief Germanic pagan priests. And what this priest says to convince his king to accept Christianity as opposed to his pagan religion. Pretty cool when we read it. We'll talk about that on Tuesday, maybe today. Okay? So, that's 597. So within 100 years of that, England is pretty much Christianized from the southern coast to the north. Okay? Now, I need to back up for a moment. Because what does this imply? This implies that prior to 597, there aren't any Christians in England. Not true. There are Christians in England possibly before 100 AD. But it's not England then, it's Britain or Britannia. Okay? How do you know? Well, there was just another discovery just announced just a few days ago in Somerset, England, okay, of a huge Romano-Christian burial. I think if I remember correctly, over 300 bodies. Roman Christians. This is pre-400 AD. Okay? Go to the British Museum, go to the Roman British room, and you'll see mosaics all over the place with Christian imagery. Okay? Christ the Good Shepherd, the Cairo, various other things. All right? So we know there were Christians there at the time. We know some of them even lived through the Germanic invasions. There are church locations that have been, quote unquote, had churches on them from 200 AD. Okay? But when the Germanic tribes invaded, they were pagan. I don't mean just, hey, whatever you want to do, whatever floats your boat, pagan. I mean Thor, Odin, Frigg, Freya, the whole 9 yards. Pagan. I mean, really believed it. Pagan kind of stuff. Okay? They were the ones that Pope Gregory was essentially converting and such. Okay? By 681, England is pretty well converted. And it's in 681 that, according to Bede, the miracle of Cadman occurs, which we'll talk about on Tuesday. But Cadman, if he really lived right around 680. Okay? The reason I say if he really lived is because modern historical attitudes are, oh, well, he didn't really live. This is just a story. Okay? I don't agree with that, but that's kind of the approach your book takes, so I'm going to leave it there. I think Cadman really lived. Why? Well, for one reason, to show you how odd and old-fashioned I am one of those people who does actually believe that miracles can and do occur. Okay? So, Cadman's miracle occurs around 681. We're going to talk about the importance of this when we talk about Cadman. Bede writes his history in 731. Bede is not only a historian, he is what's called a polymath. The guy is good at everything he tries. He writes history, he writes science, he writes mathematics, he writes biblical commentary, he writes science, he writes geometry, he writes about music. Everything he does, he succeeds at. Okay? It's from Bede, in fact, that we get, even though it's no longer commonly used, BC and AD. He's the one who comes up with that. Okay? What does BCE stand for? Before the Common Era. What is the Common Era determined by? Still, even though it's not included, yeah, it's still the birth of Christ, even though we're trying to be, removing that out of it. Okay, so when does the Common Era begin? You can't stipulate it without, that reference point, let's say. Okay? 787. In other words, 50 years after Bede writes the ecclesiastical history of the English people, which is often taken to be the first real history book. For the simple reason that Bede does things modern historians do. He verifies sources. Yeah, a lot of Bede's stuff is first-person account. He talks to people. But then he also gets second accounts to verify that. He writes to the Pope. He sends messengers to look at the papal archives, to read the letters that are in the Vatican Library. Okay? 787. First of the Viking invasions is recorded. Actually, in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle for this year, it states, very cryptic entry. In this year, 3 longboats were seen. That's it. 3 longboats on the ocean were seen. Okay. We know the actual date was 793. It's misdated in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. But the Viking invasions, not Anglo-Saxon, the Viking invasions began 793. And they go on for roughly 200 years. I mean, there are some periods of peace, but they're coming and going. What do we mean by invasions? Well, they initially start by hitting a hamlet on the coast somewhere, hitting it, torching the church, stealing what's valuable, and leaving. But after a while, they come and then they stay. They stay for the winter. Why? Winter in England is nicer than winter in Norway, or winter in Denmark, or winter in Iceland even. Okay? Because you had Vikings coming from all 3 of those areas. Okay? Even some from Sweden, but not many. Most of the Swedish Vikings went east into what became Russia. Rus, it's a Viking word. It means red. Probably refers to the color of the hair. Okay? Of the native inhabitants, the Russians, not the Vikings. Okay? So those go on for a while. 871, we have a very, how do I call this? A serendipitous occurrence. A man who was never supposed to be king becomes king. The youngest of 5 brothers. Okay? Alfred rises to the English throne. The only English king, or monarch for that matter, with the epithet the Great. Alfred the Great becomes king, okay, in 871. In 878, didn't include that. In 878, he defeats a massively larger Viking army led by Guthrum the Dane. Okay? And when I mean massive, I mean like 12 times his size. And makes Guthrum sue for peace and creates what is called the Dane Law. The Dane Law is, if you were to look at this map, actually, let me just do this. Stupid cards. That's good enough. You go from essentially London up to Chester. following this road that's called Watling Street. Okay, it's a Roman road. Okay, everything north and east of that becomes the Danelaw. What does that mean? That's the area where Danish law holds sway. Everything south, essentially, of that here is part of the Kingdom of Wessex. That is England. That's Alfred's territory. Okay? That division is created because of Alfred's defeat of Guthrum the Dane in 878. Now, who has more land? The Danes, clearly. So it looks like, well, Alfred was a sucker, you know, he got screwed on that deal. No, he didn't, because he was severely outnumbered. What he bought, it was essentially 15, 20 years of peace, okay? Which enabled him to do a variety of things. One, build an English navy so that they could contest the seas against Viking raiders, okay? And what his son and grandson did is they pushed the Danelaw back. So that his grandson fought an army of 5 kings, okay? Tolkien's The Hobbit, the Battle of 5 Armies, that's where he gets it from. Fought in the Battle of 5 Kings and defeated the Vikings, the king of the Scots, the king of Iceland, the king of Ireland, okay? And united, essentially, all of England under one crown, his. Yes?
Really quick, I got confused. So the Danelaw, that was the Vikings, or that was?
Yes. The Vikings / Danes.
Okay. So then Alfred was the rest of that.
Alfred was in Wessex, yes. Okay. The English often call the Vikings simply Danes or heathens. Take your pick, okay? Because they were all thought to be the same. Vikings at this time, the Danes and the Norwegians were not Christian. Christianity did not reach northern Germany or Norway or Denmark until about 1000 AD. Okay? And once it did, you then start getting these Christian saints as kings, men who were later called saint, like Olaf. There's a college in Minnesota named after him, St. Olaf College. Okay? We're going to talk about one in just a moment. Okay? So Alfred kind of pushed that back a little bit, and then his grandson. So you get a rough period of about 200 years where, yeah, there are some Danish Viking incursions, but Wessex is gradually moving back. Well, let's jump up to 991. It's 1049, we get out of here at 11:05. 991. England is now a self-contained country, okay? So there's no more Danelaw. It's all English at this point. There is a great-grandson, I think, of Alfred on the throne by the name of Athelred. Name looks like this. Athelred, and he has a nickname, Unrad, which often gets translated unready. Doesn't mean it. Unrad, the rad part, both here and here, means advised. We still use this word in one context today. Only one. You get arrested, what must the police do? They must read you your rights. But read there comes from this. What does it mean? Does it mean the cop's a moron and has to literally pull out the little card that says, you have, no. It means advise. You must be advised of your rights. You must be read your rights. Athelred means princely advised. Alfred's name is Alfred. It's actually this. Alfred. Elf advised. That's pretty damn cool. Because that means supernaturally advised. Not like elves or angels. Elves are otherworldly beings in Anglo-Saxon and medieval literature. Okay? Well, I mean, how else could he come up with, the idea of this peace treaty with Guthrum the Dane, Guthrum the heathen, whereby Guthrum, one, becomes a Christian, and two, Alfred becomes his godfather. Not Marlon Brando, godfather, but godfather meaning, I'm going to make sure you follow the Christian faith properly. And apparently, according to all accounts, Guthrum really did take that conversion seriously. He didn't go to war against the English ever again. Okay? So, Ethelred, princely advised, unadvised, or ill-advised. Okay? 991, you have what's called the Battle of Malden. Fortunately, we don't have time to read the poem. Battle of Malden, famous battle, but it's very minor. It's very unimportant historically, but it's hugely important literarily. Why? Because somebody memorialized the battle in poem, in a verse. Big, long verse. We only have a fragment of it. The fragment we have is over 300 lines. The whole poem was probably well over 600 lines. But it has at the very end of the poem, and we'll talk about this because I will do this before we get to Beowulf. The end of the poem has the greatest account of the Germanic heroic ethos, okay, ever expressed. I mean, and it's just fantastic. But it's near the end of the Old English period. But it's showing there's this heroic ideal still, as these English are getting cut down by this larger Viking force. Okay? 1014. England is invaded by, you're going to love this guy's name, do it, by Svein Forkbeard. So he's got a big long beard that he pulls off like this, from Norway, and Ethelred flees. He abdicates the throne. He goes to France. Leaves his wife behind, Emma. Okay. Svein dies. His son, Canute, okay, modern day spelled C-A-N-U-T-E, but Canute, C-N-U-T, becomes king, is sworn in as king. He unites the kingdom of England with the kingdom of Norway. Okay. He marries Emma, has children by her. That's what leads to William the Bastard of Normandy. I'm going to give him the name the English call him. The French call him William the Conqueror. Okay? So, Canute reigns for a good long time. Nearly 20 years. He dies. 1035, his son becomes king. He lives for a few years. He dies. 1044, I think it is. Ethelred's son becomes king. Take that back. That's 1042. Edward the Confessor. Such a holy name. Why is he called Edward the Confessor? Because he and his wife didn't have any children. It's thought he was so holy he would consummate his marriage. Well, that's one idea. The other idea was that he didn't like women. Okay? He becomes king. In the 1050s, Edward goes to France. Okay? And according to the Bayeux Tapestry, which is this piece of cloth about 18 inches wide and over 240 feet long. Okay? It's a single piece of cloth. The Bayeux Tapestry. According to it, he was captured and he swore an oath to William of Normandy. Duke of Normandy. And the oath was, upon my death, you will become King of England. Why? Because William had a distant claim through the marriage of Canute and Emma, okay? Edward's mother. And in the bio tapestry, it shows, the two of them sitting on opposite sides of a table. And beneath the table on the stretcher, the thing that links the legs together, there's a Bible. Kind of like Edward was tricked. He swore on a Bible, right? Well, Edward dies. January 1st, 1066. He dies January 1st, 1066. The Witan, okay, which is the king's council of advisors. Think of them today as the president's cabinet. The Witan then meets to elect a new king. Edward didn't have a child. Okay? So they need to elect a new king. Well, the most powerful of the Witan is a man named Godwin. He has two sons. One of them is named, you love these names. One of them, the eldest, is named Tosti, and the youngest is named Harold. So Tosti Godwinson and Harold Godwinson. Tosti means heady, like full of himself. Well, the Witan chooses the younger brother. Older brother doesn't like that. So older brother flees England, marches off to Norway, where he speaks with Canute's grandson, I believe it is, a guy by the name of Harald, not Harold, Harald Hardrada. Literally, hard deeds. In other words, Harold Badass. Not a guy you want to meet up with in a dark alley. Okay? These two unite forces. Okay? And in September, so Harold Godwinson is elected king January 4th. Right? Word reaches William the Conqueror in March. He's upset because he wasn't elected king. So he starts building a navy. September rolls around, and on September 25th, word reaches, or just before then, word reaches London to Harold Godwinson, your brother and the King of Norway have invaded the north of England. Show the whole map. There we go. So, Stamford is here, London is here. Okay? So, Harold now has to raise an army to fight his brother and the invading King of England. Why? He doesn't have a standing army. What time of year is it? Harvest time. So he has to raise the army as he marches north. If I remember right, it's about 150 miles. Okay? So he raises his army, he marches north, he defeats his brother and the Norwegian army, and while he's up there, word reaches from the south of England, right about down here, actually somewhere down in this range, I can't remember exactly. Oh, by the way, William of Normandy has landed at Pevensey. That is on the southern coast. So now he has, take that back, that's about 180 miles. So now he has about a 250-mile march from Stamford, England, down to the southern coast. Why? He's got to fight another battle. He has another invader. Problem is, he can't use the same army. That army was raised for one specific purpose, to fight the battle in the north. Now he has to raise another army to fight the battle in the south. That's how it worked. It's how Anglo-Saxon law worked. I mean, pretty good law when you think about it, okay? So now he has to march south, and he does. And on October 14th, 1066, they fight what's called the Battle of Hastings. It's not at Hastings. Hastings is actually 5 miles away. It should be called the Battle of Battle, because the town that is where the battle occurred is now called Battle, okay? So if you ever go to the Battle of Hastings, you take a train to Hastings, and then you get a bus to Battle, okay? And you can go and you can walk the actual battlefield, which has changed a little bit, okay? Because Henry VIII took the abbey that was built over the place where Harold Godwinson killed and destroyed it. And then they plowed off the top of the hill and leveled out a little bit, okay? The hill that they fought on. And very, very briefly, Harold, according to the biotapestry and anecdotal account, was killed by an arrow through the eye, okay? And William felt really bad. How bad? He built an abbey over the site where Harold died. And the actual spot where Harold died is where the altar was raised. If you go there today, there is merely a plaque on the ground. Why? Because the abbey is gone. With very few exceptions. There are a couple of walls and like some cellar rooms and things like that. Okay. If I remember, maybe I'll post some pictures on the D2L website, because it's pretty cool. But you can walk the whole battlefield and everything. And the thing is, the English shouldn't have lost. They lost because they were stupid. Because the battle occurred throughout the day, and the way it began is when Harold got down there, the battle site looks like this. Okay? William and his forces took the low ground. Okay? Harold and his forces got the high ground. Okay? Military strategy 101 says do not take the low ground. Take the high ground. Why? Because then the other guy has to march uphill against you. And among the French forces were cavalry. It's hard for horses to go uphill, especially when these guys have spears and bows. Okay? But the French attacked. They were defeated. They ran away. I mean, the French. The French attacked. They got defeated. They ran away. Happened 3 times. The third time, the English shield wall, it's where we get the phrase, part of where we get the phrase to stand shoulder to shoulder. It means shoulders are interlocked. The English shield wall disinterlocked and chased them. It was a ruse by the French. Because when the English ran down, if you look at it from a top view, the French are like here. The English run after them. The French are running this way. And unbeknownst to the English, behind the trees, the French are hiding superior forces, and they get them in a pincher movement and kill them. Okay? December 25th, 1066, William the Conqueror has himself crowned King of England. Why December 25th? Because another famous monarch of Germany had himself crowned king, actually Holy Roman Emperor, on December 25th in the year 800, Charlemagne. And William kind of thought of himself as the re-embodiment, though he never quite got the real title. Okay, we'll stop there, since it's 11:05.